Okay, I think, given the situation, I think we should talk about Venezuela principally.
Yes.
But let me just introduce it by saying a little bit about what the pink tide means, and why there's a book over there about it. The pink tide was a phrase conjured up by a not very friendly person, referring to the extraordinary rise of mass popular resistance movements across Latin America throughout the first decade of the 21st century. And it was significant in all sorts of ways. Significant because, in a sense, Venezuela is exemplary, but the same process you could see in other countries. And essentially, after a decade in which Latin America was dominated by the rules and the programs of the IMF, they always have names, they have experts in conjuring names which don't say what they're really about. So they called it structural adjustment, then it became the war against poverty. But to us, it's very clear what it was an assault on the living standards of the majority, a reimposition or intensification of foreign control and domination of Latin America's natural resources, what the great writer Eduardo Galeano called famously the open veins of Latin America, tapping into the veins of Latin America, and the reimposition of the domination of the global market, which began really in the mid-80s into the 90s. And what it meant practically, right, was the if you like, the increasing concentration of economic activity in Latin America on extraction of minerals, mining, oil, and so on, and on export agriculture, which meant that through that decade, millions were expelled from the land in order to make way for cattle raising, for producing maize for ethanol, not for eating, but for ethanol, and so on. Huge expansive land, people expelled from the land and ending up in the expanding shanty towns around every city in Latin America. The undermining of local industry and local manufacture, creating a whole new layer of people who were unemployed, and many of them would end up selling stuff on the street. That would be where many of them would gravitate in order to survive. And at the same time, the local state, the states were always dependent on foreign powers, but undermining in a sense the role of the state. There had been moments, for example, in Mexico. Mexico was a country, it was a very large economy, and it had a policy of protecting some of its own products. One example is maize. Small farmers producing maize were subsidized by the state. Okay, and the first requirement, when we hear a lot about, in this Brexit discussions about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which nobody really knows much about what it is, but if you do know what it is, it's a kind of rule maker for the global market, imposing its rules on anybody. One rule is that anything protecting individual national economies would be regarded as a restraint of trade. That is, an interference with the free movement of capital internationally. So that meant in Mexico, for example, the removal of subsidies for small farmers. Result? Well, one result was the Zapatista Rising, because this was an area of small peasant farmers who lived from maize production, who could not for a single second compete with the biggest maize producer in the world, which is the United States. So that meant, in a sense, they were thrown into poverty. These are just examples of what structural adjustment meant. And actually, what it meant in one country suddenly became very significant in this process we're talking about. Because in 1989, there was a presidential election, and one of the two parties that have dominated Venezuelan politics for 45 years had their candidate, Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was instructed publicly by the IMF to impose structural adjustment policies. During his presidential campaign, he said he would not permit the IMF's programs to be imposed in Venezuela. He would fight. It may come as an extraordinary surprise to you that 2 weeks after the election, he announced the imposition of the structural adjustment policies. The first consequence of which was the immediate rise in transport prices because of the rise in the price of petrol. The consequence was a massive explosion of resistance and protest across the poor districts of Caracas and actually right across the country. It was called the Caracazo, the rising of Caracas. It was put down in 3 days, leaving 3,000 dead at least. Nevertheless, it was a sign of two things, really. the fact that a decade was about to come in which everything that had been gained, everything that, in terms of living standards would be taken away, that there would be repression to boot, and that was a sign of one thing. The other thing it was a sign of, though it wasn't necessarily recognised at the time, was the existence of a whole network of grassroots organisations, not necessarily connected to political organisations, though many were, but a real activism in the local barrios. That had a 20-year history or longer. And so that rising wasn't just an explosion of rage, it was also, a movement of resistance, which was organised from below, but which was crushed by direct military repression. The Caracazo is an important moment. It was, if you like, the threshold to a decade of repression across the whole of Latin America. This was true everywhere. It was true in Bolivia, it was true in Ecuador, it was true in Argentina. But as the 21st century dawned, there emerged a series of movements of protest and resistance, which were more radical than things that had gone before. Number one, because they created, in those struggles, there emerged new kinds of organisation, grassroots organisation, often not linked to political parties, but in most cases, bringing together different sections of the population, as in the first instance, just trying to resist the impact of 10 years of structural adjustment. In the case of Venezuela, for example, which was quite prosperous, it's an oil-rich economy, and to about the middle of the 80s, it was relatively prosperous. By the end of the 90s, 63%, according to the UN, 63% of the population were living in extreme poverty. This despite Venezuela being the second largest oil-producing country in the world besides Saudi Arabia. So, obviously there was resistance, there was protest, there was deep resentment. The same thing was happening everywhere. It seemed about 10 years for that resentment, for that protest to begin to organize itself and begin a fight back. In some senses, the election in late 1998 of a young parachute regiment colonel called Hugo Chavez was really a sign of what was to come, because his political program, which he put and won the presidential election, was essentially a liberal program about rights, about democracy, but central to it was one central demand: the nationalization of Venezuelan oil, which up till then, just to be clear, until then, there was a kind of nationalization which was fraudulent, but up till then, Venezuelan oil was sold, was really organized by multinational corporations who paid around 1% of their earnings in royalties to the state. Now, 1% of that degree of oil, 2+ million barrels a day, if you're just distributing it among a small section of the population, then the crumbs from the table are pretty rich, and it enabled them to sustain a state based essentially on corruption and patronage for 45 years. The gravy from oil is enough to feed quite a lot of people, but not the poor, not the shanties, not the 6-7 million people living in Caracas, for example. The vast majority in the hillside barrios. He was elected. He was elected on this program, but he was famous for one thing, and that was that in February of 1992 he had launched a coup against the government, a military coup. It was a failure. It lasted 24 hours, and then one of those wonderful moments that occur in history, he was called by the president to come to the television studios and announce that his coup had failed, which he did. He said, he went on television and said the coup has failed, and then he uttered two words which changed the face of things. He said, "Por ahora." For now. Por ahora then appeared on walls all over the country, and then he returned in 1998. His opponent in the election was Miss Venezuela. The important part being not that she was a Miss Venezuela, but that she was very white and from a very wealthy area, from Chacao, from a very wealthy area of Caracas. It was the beginning. But most importantly, really, the following year, in 1999, amid the most appalling natural disaster, a great mudslide that engulfed probably at least 100,000 people, La Vaguada, an assembly was held to write a new constitution called the Constituent Assembly. The point about this Constituent Assembly was that it wasn't a parliament, it was a genuinely elected assembly, elected by people in their local districts after public discussion. It was a kind of festival of democracy, and what emerged from it was a constitution in which there were many clauses, but there are three central ones. The first, the nationalization of oil, so that the revenues from oil should be used for the majority of the people through social programs and so on. It was called sowing the seeds of oil. That was what the program was called. In other words, taking the 1%, in the first instance, as in Bolivia, raising the 1% to 50%, but so taking the revenues from oil to, in a sense, restore the living standards of people who had suffered so badly in the previous decade. The second clause, which was fundamental as it would turn out, was a clause that described the new republic as a participatory democracy. In other words, democracy from below. And the second clause of that said that the people, the masses, would be the subject of change, the subjects of the subjects of the new republic. It would be run by through mass organizations, and there were other clauses that reinforced the idea that there would be new forms of organization, democratic, grassroots, and so on. In a society that had been run by a small elite, corrupt, clientelistic system from above, that was deeply meaningful. And the third clause of great importance was that what was called the recall of public officials. In other words, after 3 years, after halfway through a term of office, by referendum, by popular referendum, people could be removed from office. So that was the right of recall. These were important. But that idea of participative democracy was a bit theoretical to some extent in Venezuela in 1999. It began to take on teeth and began to manifest itself physically and visibly a year later in Bolivia. In the city of Cochabamba in Bolivia, the government announced, they didn't inquire, they announced the privatization of the water company of the province of Cochabamba. The corporation that bought it will be familiar to you. It was called Bechtel, one of the two major corporations that ran the Iraq War, right? The other was Halliburton. Bechtel was sold the water company. And again, one of those tiny things that can provoke, a spark that can provoke a forest fire. In the contract, they were allowed to charge for rainwater. And in a sense, they were also charging for everything else, but there was something about that. And a movement arose called the Committee for Water and Life. It was led by a young anarchist, well, not so young, an anarchist shoemaker, worked in a small shoe factory called Oscar Olivera. But it embraced every section of the population. The people who lived in the barrios were organized, students, school kids, the number of small factories that were still survived in Cochabamba, they joined, and all the indigenous communities around who had long traditions of sharing of husbanding and sharing their water through ancient traditions of communal control. But they would have come under the same contract. They joined too, and suddenly, early in the year 2000, they converged on the city of Cochabamba and took on the state and fought for 3 weeks. This was called the Cochabamba Water War. It won. Bechtel was removed. The contract was rescinded, and the water was then placed under communal control. Now, what was important about that was that this was the first victory against a major corporation in Latin America. Secondly, in the course of that resistance, something else was happening. The emergence of new kinds of organization. The political parties were simply not present. They weren't generally involved with indigenous movements or barrio movements or street movements. By and large, they weren't involved. And in any case, the previous decade had damaged, if you like, the left, the official left, very severely. Largely because the trade unions, in the course of those 10 years of structural adjustment, the trade unions were undermined and effectively destroyed, and the relationship with the state, which had given them some degree of influence, was also destroyed. So in a sense, what you had is an upsurge of a different and new kind of movement, sometimes called the social movements, but their politics were not simply, they began fighting material causes, but very quickly the demands turned into something else. And that something else was expressed then 3 years later in Bolivia in two mass movements of indigenous people living in a city. La Paz is in a kind of bowl up in the Andes, and above La Paz, surrounding the top of the bowl, is a city of 1 million people called Los Altos, which is entirely indigenous, entirely Indian people come down from the mountains. And they struck. Now the problem with Los Altos is the airport's in Los Altos, and the main highways taking things into La Paz go through Los Altos. So the power that they had and exercised in a battle for control of water and control of gas. Gas as the main fuel that people used ordinarily. So you had a movement then which was spreading, proliferating, but it was also creating important new organs of control, which in that case were called town square assemblies, in which were generally democratic assemblies in the center of towns. In Venezuela, that moment came in 2002. I don't know if any of you have seen a documentary called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, which was it was made by Irish television, RTE, who happened to be making a film about Chavez, right, on the 12th of April 2002. What they didn't know, which Chavez didn't know, was that a coup had been prepared. And on the 11th of April, and a coup had been prepared by the equivalent of the CBI, the employers' organization, the army, the church, the usual band of thugs, really. And they entered the presidential palace and announced that they had taken power. The head of the CBI is a favourite moment of mine. The head of the employers' organisation says, well, I'm here. Obviously, I never expected this, and I certainly never imagined I would be asked to be president, but, in the national interest, I must do so. And then he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a presidential sash, which he just happened to have with him, and put it on, So that was Carmona, So 48 hours later, the cameras of the Irish television team pan around the windows of the palace, and through the windows you see massing a demonstration of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and because of the baseball caps and the t-shirts where they've come from. The hills have come down to surround the palace and demand the return for Chavez. Now, for me, that is the moment when Venezuela moves from being, a progressive political proposal to being something deeper. Because in a sense, that was the moment when the masses took charge. And so at that point, the phenomenon of mass organization from below spreads. Now, in the context of Venezuela, that is what we mean by participative democracy. And in the years immediately after the coup, in the 4 or 5 years after the coup, a number of moves were made which reinforced the sense that popular democracy was on the cards. It was on the agenda in Venezuela, partly through things called the missions, the misiones, which were state-led programs, but under the control of communities in education, health, housing, and so on. Vast programs in these areas, and they were very significant. And then in 2005, Chavez announced that Venezuela was now home to socialism the socialism of the 21st century. It was never very clear what he meant by that, but in a sense that became the term to define the emerging governments in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Argentina, and to some extent also in Brazil, but particularly in Venezuela. This idea that what was being built there was a new kind of democracy, grassroots-based, all right, and central to it was that the funding, the finance for that social transformation would come from oil, bearing in mind that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, but at the same time, bearing in mind too that this was an era in which the oil price was rising dramatically. It actually reached $140 a barrel. It's now 53, I think, just to be clear about what the difference is. So those things combined. So the central demand, which 21st century socialism, which Venezuela had come to represent, was the demand that oil should come under national control and that the revenues from that oil should be used for the benefit of the majority. which you could interpret in lots of different ways. But it seems to me the other thing that was certainly current at that time was not just that it would be used to finance social programs, a kind of welfare state, but also that it would be used. You see, this debate about what do you do about being an economy dependent on a single product had started in the 50s and 60s around the concept of dependency. How do you escape that? How do you break the chains of dependency? And one general argument, which Chavez certainly accepted at that time, was that the thing you do is, first of all, you take control of your natural resources, and the second thing you do is use the funds from it to diversify your economy so that you are never dependent on a single product. So if you like, if the perspective, the program, was in the context of a new kind of democratic system, oil would be sown and would flourish in a series of other programs and the economy would be, the people's living standards would be raised, poverty would be, if not eliminated, then dramatically reduced, which it was, housing would be provided, and a new health system would be created for those people who up till then had no access to a health system, namely the poor, and that was done through Cuban medical personnel who were paid. But so all of that was, in a sense, what 21st century socialism came to mean. Breaking the deadlock of dependency, investing earnings from oil for the benefit of the majority, and also more ambiguously, it's still more unclear, genuinely transforming what had been a model of a centralized, corrupt state operating through corruption. And in Venezuela, this is not really very much talked about or very much acknowledged, but also with violent repression when it was required. In the early 60s, Venezuela, which is always presented as a model democracy, was actually a model of repression. They used the word disappeared before it was used in Argentina. Nevertheless, it was a kind of cozy social democracy, apparently, where people were kept loyal by the redistribution of goods, luxuries, monies, grants, and so on. That ended with the crisis of oil, and it ended through the 90s. And so Chavismo, and the international circumstances matter. Chavismo was a response to that, a positive response, and seen, if you like, as a voice of the mass of ordinary people. And it was happening, and a series of new governments who came to be called the Pink Tide found themselves in power by really the middle of the first decade of the century. In Argentina, a movement that had erupted under the slogan in 2001, in the face of one economic crisis after another. There'd been this fantastic rising under the slogan, que se vayan todos, let's get rid of them all. And you can understand who the them were. And then about 5 or 6 presidents succeeded at a rate of 10 days apiece. But then the Peronists came back with a radical program, apparently, and established themselves and claimed to be part of this general movement. It's more problematic. In Ecuador, a massive rising, really led by the indigenous organizations who had been fighting the Ecuadorian government for 20 years, but also a kind of civic movement, carried to power a man called Rafael Correa, who announced himself part of this new phenomenon of 21st century socialism. In Bolivia, the first ever indigenous president, although there had been an indigenous vice president a few years earlier, Evo Morales, head of the Coca Farmers Organization, and himself an Aymara-speaking Indian from the Andes, assumed the presidency late in 2005. It seemed that there was a serious transformation taking place. Certainly, on the surface it was. If you looked at the Ecuadorian parliament, you looked at the Bolivian parliament, or indeed you looked at the Venezuelan parliament, less the Venezuelan parliament, but you suddenly, those parliaments looked completely different from any prior parliament for one very good reason, that they were full of 50% women, and because they were full of indigenous people speaking a dozen different languages, wearing the clothing of their nations, of their communities. That cultural revolution was visible and tangible. You could see it. Aymara became an official language, and so did Quechua in Bolivia, and so on. So that was, in a sense, that was the height. And the central policy of each of these governments was the nationalization of extractive industries, the use of the revenues from those industries for the benefit of the majority, and the gradual diversification of the economy. That was the hope as the first decade came to an end. In 2013, now I want to concentrate on Venezuela. In 2013, in February, Hugo Chavez died in Cuba of a disease which remains unexplained. He was succeeded in power by Nicolás Maduro, who won an election in April of 2013 with a majority of less than 1%. Maduro used the language of Chavismo. He claimed to be the inheritor of Chavez's policies. He, at one point, famously, stupidly, he said, Chavez is sitting on my shoulder. But in that first year of campaigning, every single day, if you arrived in Venezuela not knowing where you were, you'd assume that Chavez was still alive. He was on the radio all the time, he was on the television all the time, just being replayed and replayed and replayed. Maduro used that, the incredible, the very high level of loyalty and belief and credibility of Chavez, who was deeply charismatic. But what was really significant was that his last document before he died was a plan for the economy called the Plan de la Patria 2013 to 19, and he wrote a preface to it. And in it he said, we said we would transform the state, but we haven't. On the contrary, he said that the state has transformed us. We have to go back to the project, destroy that bourgeois state which still exists. Instead of us destroying the state, instead of us taking on the state, we have been taken on and absorbed by, our people have been absorbed by the state. And that was made possible because in 2006, a new party was created, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, which was, Chavez announced it. He always did things like this. He announced it on television without telling anybody. Right, we're now going to create a mass democratic party. Everybody should join tomorrow. So they announced it. 6 million people joined in a matter of weeks. Except that it wasn't a mass democratic party, because the model of the party that then emerged weeks later was the Cuban model of extreme centralization and really absent any kind of genuine grassroots democracy. I was there and I was talking to people about, what was going on in the party, and said, well, we were told we could elect our delegates, and then we've just had instructions that we can't. They're imposed. So this centralized organization reflected a much deeper change. The emergence of a ruling group and of a structure which, in a sense, was the opposite of the promised mass grassroots democracy. Now that's, to understand Maduro, we have to understand that. So back to 2013, there was, he was elected with a very slim majority. For the next 2 years, street barricades happened. There was violence in the streets, resistance, and the opposition now emerged in a way that they couldn't have done against Chavez, because his popularity was too embedded. Okay. I want to leap ahead then to the present and explain it against that background. Am I okay for time?
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the leading figure in that period of the barricades was a member of one of the wealthiest families in Venezuela called Leopoldo López. López ran an organization later which became called Voluntad Popular, the People's Will, to which Guaidó also belongs. López was arrested and placed detained. Now he's currently under house arrest. But López remained, if you like, the favorite, definitely of Washington. His wife was a regular visitor to Obama's White House as well as Trump's. She's very, very, very sharp. She toured Europe incessantly, connecting with Spain particularly, because if the right wing was actually funded and ideologically shaped by a foundation that nobody ever talks about, which is run by the ex-Prime Minister of Spain, called the Aznar Foundation. Lots of money, very active, shaping the right in Latin America, which they certainly did, not just in Venezuela but beyond. So the right was shaped by these people, resistance to Maduro, fighting against Maduro. Actually, within a year of the death of Chavez, Maduro was negotiating with the richest man in Venezuela, a man called Lorenzo Mendoza. He invited him to chair an economic committee in conjunction with the government. Now, these were signs of things to come, but anyway, then the key moment really is a year after that, in 2015. There's an election for the National Assembly. And to everybody's surprise, the right wins at 63% of the votes for the National Assembly, and thus a majority. It was almost a definitive majority, but they found that two of the candidates were unfairly elected. Anyway, so they had a majority in the Assembly. Now, the significant thing about that was not just that they had the majority in the Assembly now, but that why did they have it? Was this a major shift to the right in Venezuelan politics? Were Venezuelans now moving generally to the right? The answer is clearly no, because they won that election because 2 million ex-Chavista voters did not appear and vote in that election. So it's the big, and I think, had I been Maduro, or had anybody, had the eyes to see, they would have seen that as a warning. We will not support you automatically. We're not the donkeys that can always be brought to the ballot box. We support you insofar as you carry forward the policies for which you were elected. And that was a protest, a warning. Now, but Maduro's interpretation, as to the right, the crisis that we can talk about in a second was also beginning and deepening, but just at its beginnings. But neither Maduro nor the right had any solution. The right had only three policies. Maduro out, reprivatize oil, and release Lopez from prison. Those were the three planks of policy of the right. They couldn't agree on anything else, and therefore they had nothing to offer as the crisis began to develop and grow. It was already very clear. Prices were already beginning to rise, exponentially. Things were beginning to disappear from supermarket shelves. I decided I would follow the story of a pot of yogurt, which I became very fond of, to try and see what happened to that pot of yogurt. Well, its prices doubled, trebled, quadrupled as the weeks went by, and then the yogurt disappeared altogether. Not that it was. Let me be clear. It wasn't the same pot of yogurt. It was. Anyway, the crisis was deepening. But the response, when the Assembly was elected, this in the context of a declaration of mass democracy, Maduro immediately announced the creation of a state of exception, which still exists today. Now, what did that mean? A year later, it became clear. In 2016, I'm sorry about the dates, but they're important, 2006 of his government, and it was called the Arco Minero Project. 12% of Venezuelan territory covers the Orinoco Basin and the Amazon Basin. And it is the source of an enormous cornucopia of minerals. Not only oil, not only gas, but gold, diamonds, copper, bauxite for aluminium, uranium, and water, because the fresh water for Venezuela largely comes from up there, from the Coronino. So. And I was in Venezuela at the time, and there were a number of meetings with, leading ex-Chavistas about what was going on there, indigenous organizations. The problem was that he announced that the area would now be offered to 150 multinational corporations for development. It's important to underline the fact that these corporations were Chinese, Russian, Belarusian, as well as North American, and, above all, Canadian. One of the people who've come out and supported Trump, perhaps to people's surprise, has been Canada, which immediately announced its support for the invasion. You might have been surprised until you knew that Canada is probably, along with China, the most important supporter of mining industries in Latin America as a whole. That's the Canadian government, which has pushed these mines. Anyway, so that takes us the Arco Minero project, and to me, and this is what I'm getting around to, Maduro, in announcing the Arco Minero project, he did three things. First of all, he announced the delivery of Venezuela's mineral wealth to a multinational capital. Number two, he also announced the suspension of constitutional guarantees in the area. Now, this is an area of large numbers of indigenous communities which are covered by the Constitution. So it meant, and thirdly, he announced the militarization of the region and the creation of a new private company run by the military which would be put in charge of the commercialization of Venezuela's mineral resources. To me, that's the ebb of the pink tide. It was happening elsewhere, it was happening in Ecuador, it was happening in Argentina, and the new right was emerging, but in Venezuela it meant, to my mind, it's maybe disputable, but I think that was the revolution reversed. It was a re-establishment of the old imperial relationships. Now that takes us back to the moment then. What's the key? And to explain the kind of the way I've introduced it, because the key to understanding the decision to support Guaidó and to use him as the public face of what is it's called a humanitarian intervention. The humanitarian bit is we all know what that means. Look at Libya, look at Rwanda. Humanitarian, nothing, but an intervention it certainly is, and it's an intervention in the pattern that US in relationships with Latin America have followed always. They intervened in Nicaragua in 1932. They intervened in Guatemala in 1954. They intervened in Cuba in 2000. In 2001. They not 2001. In 1961. Sorry. They intervened in Chile in 1973, and so on and so on. Those are the interventions, and this is an intervention of that kind. It is not in any way at all. An attempt to address the profound crisis, the economic crisis the people are facing, because there is a crisis in Venezuela, a deep crisis. There is hunger, and there is a collapse of the economy, and there is a medical crisis, which I've seen. I remember 5 years ago going to a hospital in Venezuela and discovering it was full of police, but I went with my granddaughter who had been bitten by a dog, and we wanted to see if we could get an anti-rabies injection. They said, no, I'm sorry, we haven't gotten that. We've nothing like it. She'll be all right. There was no equipment anymore, but there were soldiers in the corridors. So the hospital system was collapsing. So was the barrio system, barrio adentro, was also beginning to collapse. In other words, it was perfectly clear that the whole structure was collapsing. Now, the argument that's often offered is that that's because the price of oil fell, and it did begin to fall after 2013. It's noticeable too that in 2013 the government stopped publishing statistics of any kind. So the rest is guesswork, and luckily a couple of very good economists who could provide the data. However, so what's happening was, if you put together the creation of this top-down organization, the announcement of the Arco Minero project, right, and the deepening repression, and the rising levels of genuine shortage and the price of things rising. I mean, this last year has just exploded. You get something like 5 million bolivars as a minimum wage, and that can buy you 15 eggs, packet of nappies, more or less around there. The value of money is destroyed. We were talking earlier about the fact that some commentators who are quite rightly opposed to, behind a hands-off Venezuela campaign, are saying, well, there's no hunger in Venezuela, there's no shortage of food. I've seen people, the restaurants are full. The restaurants have always been full. The only problem is you have to pay in dollars. If you have bolivars, or whatever they call them now, soberanos, you can't afford even to look through the window of a restaurant. So the wealthy are there. This is the irony. The wealthy are there, and they continue to be there. Their gated communities, their 4x4s are still around, but the gulf is widening again, and the levels of poverty are also rising dramatically. So there's a genuine crisis. We can talk about it more, in detail if you like. But the important thing is the crisis is real. The suffering of people is real. 3 million people have left Venezuela. The sinister Diosdado Cabello, one of the ruling group, said, well, people are leaving Venezuela because it's the fashion. So that's why they sell out their houses, go and sit on. That's why the psychologist from Merida, and her daughter, she sold her hair so that she could get to the border, but just for fashion reasons, I guess. No, I mean, it's cynical in the extreme, and otherwise, and it's true, I'm sure you'll agree that Venezuelans by and large don't emigrate. Colombians emigrate en masse, but Venezuelans never really emigrated. They would go abroad and travel, but they wouldn't emigrate. This is new, and it's part of the general crisis. Okay. Humanitarian? No, there's nothing humanitarian about it. The evidence, one small piece of evidence that it isn't, is that the Red Cross has refused to participate. All right? It is an intervention. It is a cynical exploitation of the despair and the crisis that people are facing, using it to win a political battle. Why the political battle? Because there's oil in them Nar Hills. There's the largest oil reserves in the world, the enormous mineral wealth of Venezuela particularly is one reason why they're intervening. And there's another reason kind of hidden behind it, which is that one of the consequences of Chavismo in Venezuela has been the increasing role of China and Russia, especially Russia in Venezuela and China all across Latin America. The Chinese, the debt to China, Venezuela's debt to China is $60 billion. Right? The debt of Ecuador to China is roughly the same. So there is an element of inter-imperialist rivalry. Why now? Well, it's because they want to get in there and re-establish control of the oil, and Juan Guaido has promised it. So who the hell is Juan Guaido? Where does he come from? Go on.
I'm sorry, I don't know a good point to interrupt you, but if you could bring it in about 5 minutes?
Yes, 5 minutes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
5 minutes it'll be, promise.
Yeah.
Guaido has guaranteed the return of oil to Citgo in the first place, which is the North American branch. Now the question arises, is this crisis the result of US sanctions? No, it isn't. There are now US sanctions directly conceived to destroy the economy. In other words, by not returning to Venezuela, the earnings on 400 to 500,000 barrels of oil which are sent to the US every day. But this isn't about oil in the immediate, it's about the control of oil and minerals over time. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, of course, it's political. Why now? Because in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a surge of the right in Latin America, exemplified by the fascist who now is president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, but also Mauricio Macri, a neoliberal militant, Piñero, head of Visa Chile, is now president again of Chile, Duque in Colombia, who is the next in line of the narco presidents, represented by Uribe, all right, and so on. The only exception to that rule is the new president of Mexico, and we'll see what happens with him. So that's the reality. The intervention this is an intervention. Based, I presume, they looked at the demonstration in January and saw that they were huge and thought that this was the support for Juan Guaido. It wasn't. Those demonstrations attracted everybody who wanted to protest in the situation. Huge numbers of people who were definitely not supporters of Guaido and definitely not supporters of his organization, People's Will, which is the furthest right of the opposition organizations, who, by the way, aren't agreed among themselves. None of the other major right-wing parties attended the inauguration of Guaido as interim president, right? So there is no program, but behind that is the man, and you heard it here first. Leopoldo López is the man they want to be president, and he will emerge sometime very soon as the real candidate of the US. Now, what's going to happen? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. What I do know is that you have a government consisting, the majority of ministers are military, the economy is dominated by the military in the US, and increasingly Maduro has ruled through militarization and repression, exemplified in the new special forces called the FAES, who are now guarding the border, but who previously were involved in repression in their barrios. So for the mass of ordinary people, for the working people of Venezuela, Guaido represents the right whose policies have always been against their interests, and they're not fooled for a second about who Guaido is. He has no electoral base, he has no evidence of any kind of support other than the outside support. Guaido represents the return of Venezuela to the situation in which it lived for the previous 5 decades. But Maduro is no guarantee of if you like, a return to Chavismo either. He has taken Chavismo, turned it on its head, delivered it to external finance, and in a sense, the thing that has undermined it all and represented it all is the enormously high level of corruption. The whole system is corrupt to its very core. I mean, there's proof that, you know, in all sorts of ways, which we can talk about. So for the working people, what's the alternative? Guaidó or Maduro? Militarized, repressive government, or the government representing the interests of multinational capital with arms? That neither of those things are choices. The problem is the great movement from below, which was so positive and so hopeful, has really been undermined, has really been disarmed. There is confusion, there is rage, there is despair, but there's a lot of confusion. So the question is what to suggest, what to argue for. A group of kind of leading and progressive Chavistas who have been very, very critical of Maduro, bitterly critical of Maduro, have suggested a referendum. And in this they've been supported by the major Trotskyist organization in Venezuela, Marea Socialista. It's hardly a revolutionary program, but it may be a way of, if you like, reopening a political space in which people can begin to operate again. Of course, if there's an invasion of any kind, a military invasion, the Brazilians are hovering and threatening, but they won't cross the border. If there is a military invasion, then Venezuelans will rise up to a person to defend their country. It'll be bloody, it'll be awful, because all the threats, I mean, Venezuela has Russian missiles, but rumor has it they're not working. In that case, they're not going to confront, and there's not going to be a military confrontation between Venezuela and in a conventional war sense. But if they cross the borders, if they send troops in, I know they did it in Panama, but this is not Panama or Honduras. This is Venezuela with an armed population, a population which is virulently nationalist and will defend itself to the last section. And I think in the last few days, last couple of weeks, the supporters in Latin America have begun to backtrack. Right? They've begun to get nervous about the possibility of invasion, because any intervention in Venezuela will not stop at the Venezuelan borders. It can't. It will spread and it will turn into a conflagration. I think even Trump might hold back from that. But they're hoping that economic sanctions plus this kind of ideological erosion might bring about what they want. And what they want is a right-wing government that does the business for them, and which also ensures US interests as against those of China and Russia. So I'd like to finish on a note of, so this is what we must do, but I can't. I'm sorry if I've gone on too long.
No, thank you, that was really good. Thank you.